What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 116, and I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Anslone, joined by the co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today, buddy?
Doing good, Kyle. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right, and this show will be released on Propaganda Day in America, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and also about a very important new leak by the heroic Daniel Ellsberg. So a lot of very important news on today's show. Make sure you share it out. You can find the show on Odyssey or YouTube for video versions. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for the full archive. You can also find the show on any of our social media accounts. That's MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. The Twitter handle being @con_interest. If you really want to help the show, you could donate. We take donations at Patreon and Subscribestar. There's also wallets in the show notes page for crypto if you want to give us some Bitcoin. And you can also support the show and get yourself some great CBD products at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com, and the promo code is PEACE, and that'll get you 25% off when you spend $75 or more on some great CBD products. I personally recommend the topicals. I like their menthol smelling sports cream. It's like 400 milligrams of CBD oil, and I just one pump and rub some on my back, and it feels like relief in 15 minutes or so, and definitely not the icy hot or the smell of some other products. So I really recommend that. Will, do you guys suggestion from Paloma Verde?
Yeah, definitely. I think people like me have trouble sleeping or trouble winding down. I think their melatonin soft gels those are personally my favorite. And then they also have these great high dose like oil tinctures for just if you want the highest dose of CBD you can get. So if any of that stuff sounds interesting, definitely check out Paloma Verde has a new website now. You can check them out at palomaverdecbd.com and be sure to use that promo code PEACE on your order.
All right, well, so every Memorial Day, well, this is the day before Memorial Day, they run a NASCAR race, the Coca-Cola 600, and it is the biggest celebration of, the veterans, but it's not really about the veterans because every time they mention the veterans, they don't say, these are the men that George Bush lied into Iraq and, that's why they died. No, every single time they're mentioned, their heroic sacrifice protected our freedom, our safety, and allows America to be a great country. And it's just it almost makes it hard to watch the race, and I really like NASCAR, and it makes it almost intolerable. I gotta keep it on mute until the very start of the race because they really have a lot of fanfare in the beginning. But if you just take a look today in any popular kind of culture in this weekend, everybody's talking about Memorial Day, and everybody talks about the heroic sacrifice of our troops to protect our freedom and our safety. And so, well, I think it's really important that we talk about and we combat this narrative because they use the legacy of these people that they got killed in pointless wars to justify waging more war, more budget, more bombs. The military industrial complex certainly use it. The mainstream media is going to capitalize on it. They're going to parade a bunch of injured soldiers around and have people go, oh, how brave and how great these people are. They'll never question their mission. They'll never question why they ended up in the condition that they're in. And they just expect everybody to kind of clap along and, realize that this is the price we pay to live in a free country. And it's just so ridiculous that, this isn't essentially George Bush hate day where we all go out and scream at the guy that got millions of people and tens of thousands of Americans killed for absolutely no reason. So, Will, I just wanted to let you weigh in and give any comments that you have.
Yeah, it is unfortunate how, like, especially at sporting events, like you said, like it's the same with NASCAR, with football as well. It's often the troops are trotted out as this big spectacle, like you said. They're just a symbol for how great America is and how much we kick ass around the world. I think people often don't think about how that makes a lot of soldiers feel. Like I know I've interviewed some vets who say they don't like that. Like getting home, pulling in the airport or whatever, everyone claps for them. It makes them feel uncomfortable sometimes, just because some of the things they've had to do sometimes they're not extremely proud of. So that I think people ought to be more mindful about that kind of thing rather than just sort of rah rah cheering on the soldier when you see them. Be mindful that maybe this is gonna make them feel some kind of way that you wouldn't want to make them feel. And I think a lot of the people too, a lot of the most like loudest, most vocal people who say, we have to support the troops and are, especially on, days like Memorial Day, they're precisely the same ones who are, ready and willing to send these same people off to die in a conflict or get their limbs blown off that has nothing to do with us or that is, actively, outwardly against our interests, like intervening in Syria or something on behalf of Al Qaeda. And so it's just, I don't know. It is interesting how the very people who would sort of like, criticize you and I for being, hating the troops or hating the country, they're the very first ones who will send them off to die. Um, so I don't know. I think they get it exactly wrong. It's us. It is the non-interventionists who, that includes a lot of veterans too. It's not just people like us who haven't served, but it is us who are, supporting the troops the most and who are supporting the country the most, I think. Because I think our critiques are often that these interventions, this empire is destroying and bankrupting our country. It is the precise opposite of patriotism to support that kind of stuff. So, I think people ought to, think about that kind of stuff, especially on Memorial Day.
Right. I think even a lot of people listening to this might kind of cringe at what we're saying and think, something along the lines of, oh, maybe this is kind of disrespectful to say on Memorial Day. But at the same time, not at any sense, think about like the rehabilitation of George W. Bush's legacy and reputation and the fact that this war criminal isn't in jail and how many politicians are, responsible and have lied us into this war who are still in office, who are still profiting off of this. All these, generals who, got their reputation and their stars fighting these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan or in Africa, and now are able to cash in on that by going to work at Lockheed Martin or on the board of Raytheon or something like that, right? They're going to make tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, this year, like profiting off of these wars that got Americans killed who died for no reason. Like there was no good cause to go into Iraq or Afghanistan. It made us all less safe. It cost us all a lot of money. Absolutely pointless wars, and that's not what is the most offensive thing. When anybody says anything good about George Bush tomorrow, that should be about the worst thing. Now, the other thing that always disgusts me about these days in particular, as you said, Will, is the politicians that grift off of this so heavily, who clearly don't care about the troops at all. I think I've talked about this on the show in the past, but I think it was like 2013 to 2016 or so. I was living in New Hampshire, and I would listen to the FM talk radio every morning on my way to work. And Kelly Ayotte was one of the senators, and I think Jeanne Shaheen was the other one at the time. And both of them would talk about, how we need all this more care for the veterans, and how we need to do all these great things, for them, and how we're working so hard for them. And yet, they would pass a $600 billion Pentagon budget, and there wasn't a VA hospital in the entire state of New Hampshire. And it happened year after year after year. And it's like, oh, so you really don't care about the soldiers, because if you did, you could get one hospital built in the U.S. Trade in an F-35, you could probably get, a hospital built somewhere in New Hampshire. Even if it's small, there, a lot of the vets live close enough to a lot of the other states where they could get there, but build somewhere rural and up north, and that would be really helpful. But, they never thought or, bothered to do that, because it's not about actually helping the vets. It's about, being a part of and contributing to this narrative of the vets are great, so we have to spend more on our military to make sure our military is the greatest because it has a great mission. And if you question the mission, then you're questioning the vets, who are the great heroes of our society, who will sacrifice their lives for us. And it's so nasty. And then the other thing I'll mention is that Kamala Harris recently tweeted out the whole everybody enjoyed their 3-day weekend thing, which is a pretty terrible thing to tweet out from the lady who's I don't know how much control she has over the U.S. foreign policy, but if she really wanted to, she could have a lot of influence over it, and is just allowing these wars to continue, and isn't speaking out against them, right? And saying that, oh, everybody enjoy your 3-day weekend, like that's pretty absurd thing to say. But at the same time, again, this isn't nearly as offensive as the fact that we're celebrating and clapping for the veterans, but only in order to celebrate the war that got them to the point where they're injured and they're suffering, are dead. So yeah.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah. And I mean, just on that sort of, you mentioned the VA. Like, I know a mutual friend of ours, a special forces veteran, has told me that he actively encourages his friends and his people to not use those hospitals because they're so bad.
yeah.
So it's interesting how, the very people who would like criticize us, oh, you're not supportive enough of the troops, they're the very same ones who are, in charge. I'm talking about lawmakers who refuse to, devote resources to the veterans they claim to, support and champion.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't that many years ago, Will, that they had the wait list that people were dying on, or
That's
they were
right. Yeah.
like month after month, they would have to send out letters to 1,000 or 10,000 people saying, oh, we weren't sanitizing our equipment right. You might have HIV. You better go get tested. Imagine if your healthcare provider was sending you messages like that. So, Will, I guess that's all I have on. I will say, and this was noted as I was watching the NASCAR race every year. They do like a little ticker on the bottom of the screen of all the soldiers that died, active duty soldiers that died, and the number was about half of what it was the year before. And in part, that's because of the actions that Donald Trump took to at least wind down the war somewhat in Afghanistan and get the whatever they call it, a peace agreement. It's not a peace agreement signed with the Taliban, but it did prevent any American soldiers from being killed in Afghanistan for well over a year now. And that is something I guess to look at back and be kind of happy about on Memorial Day. Will that at least the war, rather than surging troops, we're kind of doing the opposite. Although I think we still have to remember, and just another part of Memorial Day should be remembering that the people that are killed, the far greater numbers of people who suffer overseas from our wars.
Absolutely.
We talk about the vets, and I think 8,000 or so have died in the wars directly, and then there's 10,000 I think are more contractors that have died in combat, and then of course we know tens of thousands have died from PTSD, the effects, suicides, reckless.
Yeah.
Driving motorcycles 100 miles an hour because you've done like 6 consecutive tours in Afghanistan, trying to do
drug addiction,
drug addiction, all alcohol, all this kind of stuff, right, is taking lives over. So, but that doesn't even compare to the number of civilians that have been killed overseas, and so that is a part and a very terrible mark of all these wars, and that is, I think, Will, the big lie of Memorial Day. So, anything else before we move on? Talk about the heroic Dan Ellsberg here.
No, let's do it. Let's get into the news.
So, Daniel Ellsberg, at the age of 90, Will, is doing what he does best, and he dropped some articles dropped some new documents, I guess classified still, that say the U.S. was playing some pretty terrible acts in, 1958 in Taiwan,
that's right.
In China over Taiwan. So, Will, do you want to kind of fill us in what was in these documents?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and hope that most of our listeners would be familiar with Daniel Ellsberg, the heroic leaker of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. This like classified military study that showed that American leaders had lied about the Vietnam War and all this stuff. Very, heroic guy. And yeah, like you kind of suggested, he's still at it. He's been a sort of peace activist and an author and stuff this whole time since he leaked that classified material. But just last week, he dropped another classified document that I think he said he originally got along with the Pentagon Papers. For whatever reason, he never made it public. But now he has, and it shows that back in the 1950s, the U.S. came much closer to dropping nuclear weapons on China than anyone had known previously. And this happened, you mentioned, during a round of fighting that broke out between China and Taiwan in 1958, which is not even 10 years after like the modern Taiwanese state came into existence. In 1949, the communists defeated the nationalists, or what was called the Kuomintang, and they fled over to Taiwan and set up shop there. And since then, they've referred to themselves as the Republic of China. So all that stuff is still very fresh during this whole flare-up in 1958. And these new documents show how the U.S. military leaders were aggressively pushing for the authority to nuke China if they continued to attack China. Sort of died out, and it never got to that point. But the American military leaders were discussing that, like, if this goes on, if this continues, this Chinese offensive, that they wanted authority to bomb like all over mainland China. And now it was known previously, like, that this idea was at least considered, that they had floated the concept of dropping nukes. But these new documents, which I think are part of like a RAND Corp study, they go into a lot more detail, and they showed like just how hard the military was pushing for this, like including at very high levels, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff and stuff were all kind of clamoring for this. Now you might think, like, we're talking 1958. This is decades ago. Like, why does this stuff matter? And I do think, just like, just on its own, it's interesting history just to know that this stuff was considered. But it's also like the U.S. relationship with Taiwan is still relevant today, I think. We've backed them for some time now. It's kind of been on and off, the relationship with Taiwan. However, Trump very much ramped up U.S. support for Taiwan. He approved like a mountain of, including right up until the end of his administration, which very much angered China. Because I think we've explained this before, but China sees Taiwan as its own territory. It's this very sensitive issue with them. We just saw actually this big controversy with the wrestler John Cena having to apologize for calling Taiwan its own country. He does a lot of business in China, and the Chinese consider Taiwan to just be like a province of China that's in rebellion. However, we often do see the U.S. kind of deliberately use Taiwan to prod China, as well as Hong Kong and sort of other, like, there are other disputed territories around China that we always back other countries, their claims over those territories against China. And I do think, just sort of highlighting just how this is still so relevant, just this last week, this guy, Chris Meyer, Biden's nominee to oversee the U.S. Special Forces, this guy told lawmakers that American commandos should be training Taiwanese soldiers to how to resist a Chinese invasion, that the U.S. Special Forces should be deployed to Taiwan, which would be absolutely guaranteed to just like massively inflame tensions with China. As if the military drills and the freedom of navigation stuff, as if that wasn't bad enough. That's all right in China's backyard. Now we have the nominee to head up the special forces calling to deploy commandos to Taiwan to train soldiers. That would be a huge deal, I think. So I think this could, become very significant. Like, we now know that back in the 1950s, we were willing to potentially start a nuclear war on Taiwan's behalf. And I'm really not all that confident that today that, the people in charge are less stupid and reckless than they were back then. I think this continues to be a potential tripwire and flashpoint for conflict.
That's the point I thought was so important about this, Will, is to understand the mindset of the military and the generals. And while this was a long time ago, pretty much all along, one of the highest rated and most respected institutions in the U.S. is typically the military. When polling is done, the Supreme Court, Congress, the president, they don't always pull too high. The military, the generals, they typically pull pretty well, even if a lot of times they go along with the lie for whatever reason. We think they're the rational people. If we remember back to the start of Trump's administration, it was because General James Mattis was in the administration. John Kelly was his chief of staff. H.R. McMaster. These were the adults in the room. These were the people that were going to keep Trump in check. And here's an example of who would have been Eisenhower that really had to keep the military in check from doing something absolutely insane. Going ahead and nuking China and killing millions and millions of people here. So all fantastic points there, Will. I guess the last thing to touch on, and Danny Sherjan, the U.S. Army Major retired, I don't think he wants to be thanked for his service on Memorial Day. Will wrote in his most recent article, not even past Dan Ellsberg versus new madman theory of Cold War and press suppression, that one of the things that Ellsberg does by releasing this document is it's kind of putting the U.S. in a position where it could prosecute him under the Espionage Act. This is still a technically classified document, and so they could do that. And it's, Ellsberg essentially debating the U.S. deep state to go after him for this. And I think he would see himself as somewhat of a sympathetic figure, I guess. This is the guy who his past leads helped reveal the absolute travesty of the Vietnam War and how terrible that was. And, helped to, I guess, wrap it up. Although, I think even Ellsberg will say that, he wishes that those documents had came out a lot sooner. So, anyways, Will, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is interesting. I would like to see, not that I would like to see Ellsberg prosecuted or arrested for this, although I do think he is sort of like in a protest kind of way saying, do it. Like, I'm asking you to prosecute me for this. Because like I think, like you're saying, it would kind of force the administration to prosecute this fairly sympathetic figure, and I would hope that it would start some kind of controversy or debate around the Espionage Act. Because people will recall that is what Edward Snowden has been, or excuse me, Julian Assange has been charged with. I think Edward Snowden was, I think briefly, they considered indicting him for that, or he still is under sealed indictment or something. But nonetheless, the Espionage Act is what they use to charge whistleblowers. And in Assange's case, I guess it's sort of unique because he's like I think the first like publisher who's been hit with that specifically just for publishing. But I guess I would like to see that become a controversial issue again, and maybe some debate around the Espionage Act. Not that I would like to see Ellsberg put behind bars, but he is sort of, I guess, trying to sacrifice himself in that way.
Right. And I guess another part of the conversation that could come up here, Will, is overclassification. This is
Right.
obviously a document that shouldn't be classified. I guess it really can't have that much bearing on military policy today, and the importance of it is like again the American people understanding the history and the mindset, and so for historians to write books again now about something that happened what 60 something years ago. If I'm trying to do math real quick, then I'm not great at
Don't
doing
put this on me, man.
right. But this was quite a long time ago and doesn't need to be classified documents. And so have a conversation about overclassification and how the government could slap espionage at charges on you for releasing an overclassified document, which is something the government is in violation of the law for doing. But Will, anything else on this? I did want to note that I saw recently Kirk Campbell, who's a member of Biden's National Security Council. I believe that's an appointed position, not an elected one. It's the top Asia official on the council says that engagement with China is over, and I guess we're now in a period of competition. So this is not a great sign to be hearing from high-ranking officials who have a lot of control over this administration. What do you think about that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I guess he is sort of like we've heard Biden on several occasions now. Their whole refrain on China is that it's competition, and Biden, I think himself has made this distinction of we want competition but not conflict. But yet, if you see all the policies they're actually pursuing, of all like we mentioned some of them here, engagement with Taiwan, all these like military drills, freedom of navigation drills, this nonstop stream of rhetoric against China, accusing them of rights abuses and all this stuff. That seems to me like it's heading toward conflict. I don't see that as just being competition.
Yeah.
If we were just talking about like our corporations competing with each other or something, then sure, I guess you could call that competition. But if Biden's carrying on a lot of the same policies as Trump did, Trump, I think, would have said that like we are pushing for confrontation with China. I don't think he would have made this distinction between competition or whatever. Right. And so if Biden is just replicating all those policies, then it seems that they are headed toward conflict and confrontation, not just competition.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say like the Biden policy towards China is a policy of increased confrontation, maybe not conflict, but putting American military assets directly in and around the path of Chinese military assets in order to challenge their claims is in bodies of water called the South China Sea. That's a policy of confrontation. And look, even if we are talking about the waters around Taiwan or something like that, the Pacific Ocean is not an American lake. Will I know we have our Coast Guard on the other side of the Pacific Ocean sailing around the Philippines and stuff. So obviously there's some people in Washington D.C. who think it's the same thing as Lake Michigan, but it's obviously not. And trying to defend and actually carry out any kind of war effort, when your assets are that far away. Seems pretty reckless, and probably won't go as well as some of the, well, hell, even the military planners know, even when they run the war games, it doesn't go so well for the American side trying to operate in these areas. So I'm not sure what the idea is, other than to be confrontational in order to, appease the drummed up bloodlust for China that has been happening on the American right and left now for the past really 2 or 3 years, I guess. The whole pivot to Asia thing has been going on, but really the drum up of the genocide and the oppression of Hong Kong and all this has been the past few years, and of course hyper accelerated with some of the Wuhan potential leak in that whole story.
Yeah, all the COVID stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The guy who had said that the period of U.S. engagement with China is over. That is the dude, I think, who was one of the top like architects of Obama's pivot to Asia policy. And so now he is sort of up in this like higher level senior position. Same with like the guys like Eli Ratner, all these other China hawks who are driving policy. We talked with Dave DeCamp on the show, and Dave had mentioned he thinks that at some point they're going to start pushing to build a new foreign military base somewhere in like the Asia Pacific, and I think that's very likely that that would be sort of the natural progression here.
Yep.
But was that all you had on Ellsberg?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I know you had some. Catch us up on Iran. I know that there's been, a lot of. They're still in negotiations to revive the nuclear deal. I'm actually kind of behind on the progress of that. I know we've had a few statements from Blinken and a few different officials this week. So please catch us up there.
Yeah, so I feel like when I talked about this last week, I wasn't optimistic, but I was saying the rhetoric was optimistic, particularly coming from the Iranians and from the Russian side. I think we had a Russian delegate saying that he thought that possibly the fifth round of indirect talks that were going on in Vienna this coming week could produce a deal. We heard similar statements from the Iranian side. And then we had this statement from the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, really throwing cold water on that. Saying that saying that it would be news to us when asked about if they were close to a deal that both sides would accept on sanctions relief. So this really sounds to me, Will, like they're not moving forward with it, and that's an awful lot of cold water to throw on the talks. Now, it may be that the U.S. side really feels like they have to downplay everything until they get a deal done because of different interests in the U.S., the Republican Party, and then Israel as and Saudi Arabia and some other countries who would prefer the U.S. not re-enter into this. So maybe that's the goal here. But my concern is that there's other things going on in the Middle East that could weigh in and impact this, including a rocket we recently had landing near a U.S. base housing U.S. soldiers. I believe this the Al-Assad base. And this was the first time that this has happened in quite a while, and it was after the Iraqi Shia militias had said that their unofficial like kind of backroom truce that they had with the Americans, where they were agreeing not to target Americans at all in exchange for it giving the room for peace talks to happen between the Iraqi government and the U.S. for the U.S. to leave. Well, that never progressed anywhere. There's no plans for the U.S. to leave Iraq. And, of course, I'm sure what they saw what happened in Afghanistan, said, well, you don't seem very firm on committing to your deals anyway. So I guess at this point the Iraqis are going back to we have to apply pressure, because if there's no pressure, if there's no rockets going off, the Americans will never leave. They're real comfortable. They got their bases set up. They're going to stay. And so I think that's probably part of the calculation there. And then an Iraqi militia commander was arrested. This was reported by Reuters. Well, I'm not going to try to pronounce this guy's last name. His first name is Qassem Muslin, maybe you could give it a try for me here.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's kind of small on the screen, but yeah, that sounds right.
All right. And he was a commander who was arrested, and I believe that happened after the attack. And they said the arrest was for rocket attacks. I have no idea if that guy was actually responsible or anything, but that's
Right.
who's being blamed, Will. And those are some updates. And again, I think these kind of things will be drummed up. And we saw this during the, Gaza, what was going on. The Republicans were like, oh my God, Hamas, and then Hamas equals Iran. And so how could you possibly talk to the Iranians when they're attacking our good friends Israel right now at this very moment? So I'm sure we'll get a lot of that going on if rockets are going off in Iraq in a way to try to throw cold water on the talks to save the JCPOA. Well, I don't have anything else on Iran. Should we move on? And we have just a few threads from the Gaza bombing from those 11 days of bombing to hit on some things that are very important, and one that I think indicates war crimes. Well, we had some pilots reporting that they bombed the towers in Gaza to vent frustration. So tell us what we know about this and what the implications are if this is true.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, well, we were covering the fighting in Gaza, the 11-day kind of flare up recently. We talked a lot about how the Israelis were flattening all of these towers and high-rise buildings, like apartment blocks and media offices. I think it ended up being nine like high-rise towers in total. But as you said, recently the Israeli media talked to a few of these pilots who were flying the warplanes during all this, and some of them were voicing doubts about whether destroying these high-rise buildings is really intended to like hurt Hamas or target them, or whether that's the actual result of those strikes. And one of the pilots was saying that he thought these airstrikes were just a way to quote vent frustration, just in general, rather than hit any kind of specific target or anything. And he was kind of saying how he doesn't think this does much to degrade Hamas. It doesn't really stop the rocket fire. And to quote him, he said, "quote We failed to stop the rocket fire and harm the leadership of these groups, so we destroyed the towers." Just sort of making it sound like it was just out of like frustration and anger. And I mean, the IDF often, when they talk, they often make it sound like their strikes are very carefully calibrated and scientific, and they always have some very specific military target in mind. Like they know the guy they're trying to hit and all this stuff. But this pilot seems to be suggesting it's more just like punitive, that it's the real purpose of a lot of these strikes is just to inflict pain in general on Gaza rather than hit some valuable military asset or something. Um, Now, he was also saying too, I thought was interesting, that they had this sort of this big database or a bank of targets that they choose from. And the way he was saying this, he kind of made it sound like they're not always choosing their targets based on like what kind of military value it has. That he just sort of like they have this bank of targets they built up over the years, and they know they have to destroy something in Gaza, so they just kind of look at the bank and go, okay, that one, like how about that tower? They're not necessarily always looking and seeing like which Hamas commander is operating there or whether rockets are being fired from there. So I just thought this stuff was sort of generally revealing. I think it would sort of suggest war crimes, as you're saying, if it is just purely punitive. Occasionally, we do get IDF guys coming forward with some pretty damning, like candid stuff. That also happened after the 2014 slaughter in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, where a few soldiers came forward and said, we felt like we were targeting civilian areas deliberately and stuff like that. There's even a group called Breaking the Silence of IDF soldiers that's its purpose is to sort of have them come forward and talk about things they've done that they don't necessarily feel good about. However, in this case, with the pilots in this last round of fighting, there was another pilot who was interviewed who said that he believes the strikes are effective against Hamas and they are intended to target them and all this stuff. So certainly, it's not all the IDF soldiers and pilots who feel this way. But I think it is interesting when you do get some dissent from soldiers and from military people. You don't often hear this kind of stuff. So that's about all I had on this one.
Right, right. These are people carrying out are involved in the mission, and so if they are saying something, I don't think it's likely because they want to believe they're involved in this thing where they're bombing civilian. Right, like that would be
Right.
a pretty against interest thing to like make yourself believe about yourself. The other thing I'll add, well, yeah, the data bank of targets always disturbed me because it seems kind of like so they like have like basically somebody sitting there filling out a spreadsheet and they're like on this day Hamas met at this location, and so now it becomes a target to be bombed. And I'm not quite sure how that works. I mean, there's really no proof or review, and so if you claim two people are Hamas and they're not, or you misidentify people, it's some guy's brother and you get him confused and he's just going to see his girlfriend in that building or something, and you say, oh, the Hamas guy went in there, must have met
Right.
with somebody. So we get, like what are the standards? But also, it does it if let's say Hamas like did have some kind of operation in a building, if it's not ongoing, what does that make it a civilian target? And also, what at what point would it be an acceptable target to hit if there's 80 families living in one of these units, right? Well, and
Right.
we're just talking about a place where a couple people in Hamas also lived. If it's not a rocket facility, if they're not launching it from the second floor, at what point is it just essentially a housing unit, and the Gaza, the Hamas are people of Gaza who happen to live there, and so they're going to have some interaction and presence within that community. And can you really just identify anywhere they go as valid targets? Seems
Yeah. Yeah.
questionable.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That like the IDF often makes it like makes a lot of effort to say that, oh, we are always hitting Hamas targets and this it's not civilian. Look, they're hiding among civilians. But I often wonder too, like how are they making this designation? Like how did this building come to be labeled a Hamas military intelligence asset? Is it a cafe that two guys met in one time and now forever it's a Hamas target, or is this place, do they build rockets in this place or what? I mean, with the AP building that they bombed, they didn't give a very specific explanation. They just said that it was some kind of military intelligence asset. At one point, one of the spokesmen said something about like a high-tech piece of equipment they had in there, but they never really elaborated on that, as far as I understand, as far as I know. And so, yeah, I think it is often questionable how these things become designated, a military intelligence target or whatever.
Right. And again, they telegraphed the attack an hour ahead of time to let the journalists leave and everything like that. And so if there was like a high tech
Right.
piece of equipment, don't you think Hamas got out? You think they saw the journalists running out of the building and looking at it with their cameras and were like, huh,
Right.
nothing strange going on out there. We shouldn't leave.
But
Uh,
they're also on Twitter and stuff. They see the media. They see, all the stuff we see.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure the Hamas officials are able to translate the IDF tweets from English into Arabic. And
Right, with
that's one of the
Google.
things I want to point out is I think a lot of this rhetoric isn't even for Israeli consumption or anything like that, or to justify to in the U.S. These kind of things may be used to keep American officials from looking too bad, or from maybe legitimately facing some legal prosecution or something like that. But I really think it's
Right.
to make sure that the U.S. propaganda stays in line. And the U.S. Secretary of State is one of the key propagandists for the Israelis. He's saying that Israel took significant steps to avoid killing civilians in Gaza. And so, Will, I noticed this very interesting thing here, where Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, I guess, killed like between 60 and 66 civilians. I'm not sure if every last, I think a few of the children killed in Gaza were hit by a Hamas rocket. But
Yeah.
anyways, of the people killed in Gaza, like a quarter of them were children. If you look at the people killed in Israel by Hamas rockets, only about, I think, 15% of them were children. And so, I mean, if you're going to congratulate one side on not targeting children, it seems like Hamas killed a lower ratio of them with their unguided rockets. And uh,
Right.
there's something really wrong with this, obviously. And then, of course, too, well, we've made this point in the past, but just because somebody's not children doesn't mean they're free for Israel to bomb. We know a lot of the people were elderly, a lot of the people were women. And again, just because some, kid in Gaza is between the age of 18 and 33, or whatever, they set the number at, it's probably a little bit higher,
Yeah.
that makes them an official combatant. I mean, if you lived in Gaza, does that mean that Israel could just bomb us and kill us, and that our lives have absolutely no value, no justice should ever even be considered? We just get labeled and assumed to be militants to further the justification and the narrative that Israel kills Hamas, even if the men that they're killing are completely innocent people. They must
Yeah.
all be terrorists. You know, it is quite a crazy thing that essentially every male between the age of what I'm guessing 18 and 60 that's been killed in Gaza is assumed to be a militant, right? And
Right.
even if that's not the case, their death goes on to justify the killings of other potentially innocent men in Gaza, and their lives have even let the more Israel kills, the more they claim that they kill terrorists. It's absolutely unbelievable that they get away with that, and the
Yeah.
U.S. media never holds anybody to account for it.
Right, as if Gaza's not just a place where people live with cities and it's like it's a civilization. People live there. It's not
Right?
like
Didn't
just
you
a
see the
giant battlefield.
15-story media tower fall down? You don't think like regular people live there too?
Yeah.
Well, I know you
They're-
wrote up an article this week about the embassy in Jerusalem. Tell us what's going on with that.
I actually didn't. I only did a little bit of editing, I think, on the story. However, I do think that they're talking about reopening their Jerusalem consulate that Trump had shut down. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of details off the top of my head on this one, though.
Let's move on then and talk about Ethiopia, where the U.S. is levying some new sanctions. So we got a couple aspects of this to talk about, but what's going on with the sanctions?
Yeah, sure. I think we've done some pretty good, like, detailed breakdowns of what's happening in Ethiopia on our previous shows with Danny Surgeon, getting into like the American and French intervention in Africa and the whole Sahel region. And so people can go back and listen to, I think it was episode 85 and 106 to get like some real in-depth background on Ethiopia and just the general region and the whole American Franco terror war there. However, I do think some of this background bears some repeating because I don't think many people are all that familiar with like the general, situation in Ethiopia. So before I get to the sanctions, I will just like, recap a little bit. So our audience is aware that there's been, fighting in Ethiopia between the central government and this region called Tigray for the last 6 months or so. This started after the prime minister there in Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, tried to do this big like political consolidation. He tried to collapse a bunch of smaller parties into one big umbrella group that he controls. However, in Tigray, the main political party there, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, totally rejected that consolidation as like a power grab. Tigray has for a long time had a lot of sway in Ethiopian politics. They've had a lot of influence just over like the central government. And so this, I think they thought this threatened their power. And this got even worse after the prime minister also postponed a general election that was set for last summer. And so, this started this sort of escalation. The TPLF started accusing the government of holding power illegitimately. And this kind of escalated until last November when the TPLF launched their first actual attack. The Tigray forces sort of launched the first attack. The government responded to that with sort of like a full-on invasion of Tigray. And it's basically been this kind of civil war insurgency kind of thing since. The government has captured a lot of territory there using its own troops as well as hired mercenaries and as well as troops from Eritrea, the country next door, have come in. And I think 2,000 or 3,000 people have been killed so far. Millions of people have been displaced. Dozens of officials killed and kidnapped. And there have been claims of war crimes on like all sides, I think, like rape and torture and massacres and deliberate starvation and deprivation where they're blocking off roads and stuff, not
Hundreds of
allowing
people
aid.
at a time we're talking about too.
Oh,
It's like
yeah, yeah.
serious kinds of travesties going on in that country.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of those claims are fairly credible on all sides. Like, I don't think it's just like an atrocity story or anything. And so, with all that in mind, with just sort of that basic background of what's happening there with the fighting and the atrocities, this last week, the United States sanctioned a bunch of Ethiopian officials and military leaders with visa restrictions and also scaling back some U.S. foreign aid. Basically accusing these officials of not doing enough to end the fighting there and pressuring them to, start negotiating. And this is kind of a big deal because the United States has backed the central government in Ethiopia pretty heavily, including during the first sort of like phase of the fighting with Tigray. And as we've discussed with Danny on the show, Danny Surgeon, Ethiopia has also been this sort of like client state and partner in the American terror war out there in Africa and the Sahel. We gave them $1 billion in aid last year, which I think is more than any other African state. But now, in addition to this visa restrictions, we're also pressuring the World Bank and the IMF to stop lending money to the Ethiopian government. which is like pretty damaging. I think that's like a fairly, sometimes some of these moves don't really have teeth and it's kind of just symbolic, but this does seem to have some teeth to it, that they're, leaning on these international financial bodies to stop lending money to the Ethiopians. Now, they did also say they will be putting restrictions on Tigray officials as well. So it wasn't just the one side. But I think the fact that they're even sanctioning the central government at all is significant. Um, and the Ethiopians have sort of they're angry about this. They've responded. They're saying they're going to review their relationship with the U.S. But I don't really think there's much they can do to retaliate. I mean, I guess they could stop participating in the terror war stuff, but I think that would sort of shut off the foreign aid spigot like completely. And I think the people in power in Ethiopia benefit from some of this aid. So they'd be kind of shooting themselves in the foot if they were to just like pull out of all the cooperation with the terror war stuff. I did see also on Sunday, earlier today, there was like a big rally out there, a big pro-government, anti-U.S. rally where everyone's protesting these sanctions. But again, I don't really think there's much they can do to respond to this. So that's basically all I had on Ethiopia. The situation there is getting terrible. Like I said, millions of people are displaced. There's like a looming famine right now that's sort of artificially created by the fighting, which, as we've seen in sort of Yemen and Somalia, like that can be a disaster. Thousands and thousands of people can die when the markets shut down and the chains of distribution shut down and all this stuff. These artificial man-made famines can be absolutely devastating. So far, I don't know if the sanctions will have much of an effect. I do think the government likes getting that $1 billion a year in foreign aid from the U.S., so that may be persuasive for them to start trying to negotiate or something. But it might be too soon to say. I'm not really sure what they're going to do in response to this.
Right. Well, thanks for that. And then I want to talk about another kind of aspect of what's going on in Ethiopia, and that
Yeah, please
is
do.
with this giant dam that Ethiopia is building. For people who have listened to this show on Foreign Policy Focus, I've talked about a little bit. I'm not like a hydroelectric dam building engineer, so I can't explain all of it, but this will be one of the world's largest dams with it, like one of the world's largest holding pond reserves. It's going to take like 10 years to fill up the reservoir created by this massive dam. And
Wow.
so it's a serious thing. I'm not quite sure how these negotiations work. Like I do think you're able to use the dam before the reservoir is 100% full, but then you can't generate as much electricity, and so there's a lot of discussions and everything, because the water that Ethiopia is going to use flows into Sudan and Egypt, two countries with also big populations and a lot of geopolitical power in Africa, and both of these countries are concerned. I think of a few things. One is that if you dam the river, then it could cut off enough water from getting to Egypt or Sudan. So I think that's concern number one. Not that they would completely cut off, but say, you increase the amount of water that's flowing in the Nile in Egypt by 10%, that's going to have some pretty drastic implications for the farmers and the people who live along the Nile and who rely on the water and on the local environment and all that. So, this will have major implications. And then also, I guess there's concern that Ethiopia could then cause flooding in downstream, right? You have a dam, you release a bunch of water, bad things could happen.
Yeah.
If people
Wow.
remember back to like 2017, 2018, when ISIS controlled the Mosul Dam, and there were people
Yes.
talking about this apocalyptic group that could, unleash a tide of water that could affect millions of people that live in. Not that all of them would die, but like a significant number of people displaced and killed by this. And so, if you have the world's largest dam, imagine what you could do with that. So, there's all these risks on the side. This would give cheap electricity, and I'm sure in a generally clean way. It's not burning coal or something like that. Millions and millions of people in Ethiopia who currently don't have it. It's gonna drastically increase their standard of living, and so to try to balance and try to think about how the standard of living for a farmer in Egypt is going to decline, but 10 more families in Ethiopia have enough power that the kids could use the internet and have higher literacy rates. It's very complicated things to think about, but Egypt is really on a path to try to make this dam, I guess, if not not be completed, filled as slowly as possible. And one of the things that they're doing is building ties with other countries in the region. And so here we recently have the AP reporting that Egypt was in talks with Djibouti this past week. But if we look at a map of Africa here and see some of the countries in the region, Egypt has been in talks with Sudan, which is again one of the countries that's going to be most affected. Djibouti, Kenya, which is south of Ethiopia, Uganda, and then also Burundi. And I believe part of the Nile actually originates in Burundi. So that would be another key country to, I guess, be involved in these talks and have a say in what's happening here. So, well, this is a really complicated geopolitical situation. I've, read quite a bit on it over the years. I still say I don't understand it well enough to like kind of explain all the dynamics here, how much water we're talking about, how much is going to change the standard of living for people in Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan, how much of this is just kind of corrupt leaders trying to hold on to as much resources as possible to enrich themselves and have as much power in their little fiefdoms as possible. But we are talking about, significant states that have significant role in the American empire. Egypt, I think, is the second largest recipient of American military aid every year, depending. I think that changed a little bit with al-Sisi. He's such a brutal dictator that sometimes they don't get all their aid, but it's usually, I think, supposed to be like 1.3 billion a year. Sudan is, a state that the U.S. recently took off the state sponsor terrorism list. There's a new government there. Kenya is a state that houses U.S. soldiers, and I'm sure some of the forces that are commuting to work in Somalia are stationed in Kenya. And of course, we had some Americans killed at a air base in Kenya. I believe that was in 2020. So just a lot of important American, according to the foreign policy thinkers, American interest in this region. Well, one of the reasons I read up on, stay up on it, is I think America is eventually going to try to take a very large role in this dam, and it could, I think, lead to some real tensions and hatred for America, as we've already seen tens of thousands of Ethiopians are out on the street against us.
Yeah, yeah. Did you see recently too? I know Blinken recently had a call with CC, and it was very boilerplate. He didn't say anything very specific, but he did say like, we reiterate the America's commitment to Egypt's water security, and he was calling for like, the African Union for negotiations over this dam. And it seemed like he was kind of taking Egypt's side over Ethiopia. Egypt may be considered more of an important client state than Ethiopia is. I'm not sure how that all balances out. Or perhaps it's just a matter of like, this last week they wanted to sort of like, slap Ethiopia on the wrist a little bit. So let's give a statement that seems more partial to Egypt. But I don't know, did you see that, or do you have any thoughts about the U.S. Sort of siding with Egypt in this dispute?
I believe that's been a part of the problem with. I know during the Trump administration, the U.S. tried to hold some talks, and I think Ethiopia was typically the party that felt like the talks were unfair. So I had
Right.
assumed that was the American position. These are just, when we're talking about al-Sisi in Africa, I'm not trying to like just stereotype all African leaders as terrible despots, but we are talking about some of the absolute worst leaders here with al-Sisi. And then
Yeah.
in Ethiopia, we now have the Ethiopian government aligning with Eritrea, which is probably the most repressive state in Africa, to go in and carry out some atrocities in the Tigray region. So it's just absolutely terrible that the U.S. is giving billions of dollars to both of these brutal regimes. Even though it's interesting that just a few years ago, the leader of Ethiopia, Addis Abe, I think is his name, was
Yeah.
the
Abiy Ahmed.
recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, and
Yeah.
so
Like
he then.
Obama.
Yeah, and it's just it's such the perfect irony. Well, that it's not just that he got the Nobel Peace Prize; he got the Nobel Peace Prize for forging it and opening up ties between Ethiopia and the neighbor Eritrea, and then he then used those ties to get that army to commit war crimes against an ethnic minority in his state that he didn't like. I mean, if we wrote it, Will, as a fiction, nobody would believe it, but here we are reporting the news. So,
That's right.
everybody, enjoy your Memorial Day. Enjoy your day off. I guess you have Kamala Harris to thank for that. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but
Saint Harris.
yes. Anyways, enjoy your Memorial Day. Find conflicts of interest on Twitter, on Facebook, MeWe, YouTube, Odyssey, Patreon, and Subscribestar to donate. Will, where do people find your work?
Best place is just go to my Twitter handle. It's at the Will Porter. All the stuff's collected there, all my writing and our podcasts.
Yep. Every day, every Monday through Friday, go to Will's Twitter. 4 to 5 news stories. Usually, 1 or 2 of them at least are foreign policy or something that people in this audience are going to find interesting. And it's just so great to have somebody with a perspective of Will writing up the news. It's not like when you go to the AP and it's the same boilerplate language every single time, which is the Houthis. Funded by
Houthis.
Iran, yeah, right. Backed by the Iranians. No, yeah, a real take on some of these important news stories. So, well, thank you so much for what you do, and
Thanks, Kyle.
we'll keep doing this show. We'll be back with another one Wednesday.
See you, everybody.